Hello, welcome to Along the Flyway, the third in our series of webinars about migratory birds that visit the UK and beyond. Now, before I introduce the session, a little bit of Zoom housekeeping. This is a Zoom webinar, so you won't be able to turn your video on or your microphone, but you will be able to ask us some questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We have time allocated for a Q&A session right at the end. If there's any questions that are particularly relevant during the session, I'll drop them in as well. But if we don't get to answer all of your questions, the remainder will be answered afterwards. The session is being recorded. There is no chat function enabled for this event. If you've got any technical issues, there is someone from the events team available, but for some very specific to Zoom-related issues, we may not be able to offer any support. Now, for this third session of the series, we are leaving the shores of the UK behind, and we're venturing overseas to talk about international bird migration. Across the world, there are some known routes that birds use, and these are called flyways. You can think of these as big bird migration superhighways, invisible up in the sky above our heads. These routes connect countries and even continents through the migration of millions of birds every single year. For land birds, rather than seabirds, there are 8 of these flyways, and the RSPB actually works across a number of them. But for today's session, we're going to be exploring the one we sit on here in the UK, which is called the East Atlantic Flyway. Now, you can see that on your screens now. This migration route stretches from the Arctic all the way down to the southern tip of Africa, connecting over 70 countries and used by nearly 300 species of bird every year, including some of our best loved birds, from turtle doves and ospreys to swifts and cuckoos. Some breed in Europe during the summer and fly south to Africa for the winter. Others migrate from the Arctic down to warmer parts of Europe in the winter, in our winter, and some only use the African part of the flyway. So there are lots of different journeys being taken along this highway. In the previous 2 sessions, we learned lots about what is done in the UK to support migratory birds, and today we'll be hearing from a range of RSPB staff, as well as our international partners, about their work along the East Atlantic Flyway. To do this, we'll be taking a journey from north to south down the flyway, starting all the way up in Iceland. Now, we've got a live guest from Iceland. I'd like to welcome Hólmfríður Arnardóttir, Director of Fuglavernd, also known as BirdLife Iceland. Fuglavernd is the Icelandic member of the BirdLife family of bird conservation organisations, a family that also includes the RSPB, the UK partner of BirdLife, and over 120 national partners all around the world. Welcome, Hólmfríður. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Now, can you tell us a little bit about your work with Fuglavernd?
Oh, yes. Yeah, as you said before, my name is Hólmfríður, and I'm the director of Fuglavernd, or BirdLife Iceland, as we call ourselves internationally. We are a nature organization protecting birds and their habitat in Iceland. Fuglavernd was founded in 1963 around protecting the white-tailed eagle, but later we started to protect other species and their habitat as well. Why is Iceland important for migratory birds? Of the 75 breeding species here, 47 of them are migratory birds, and the waders are especially important group, with 11 species breeding. Here in Iceland, we have habitat that is perfect for breeding waders, like whimperl, redshank, and many more. They need large areas of natural or semi-natural habitat to breed, so it's good for those species that rely on open landscape, wetlands, and heathland. Iceland is, for that reason, an island of global importance for many different kinds of wading birds. And Iceland is definitely a hotspot for the golden plover, called Lóa in Icelandic. We have around 400,000 breeding pairs, which is 35% of the world population. And also it's probably the best loved bird in Iceland. It is our sign that spring is starting, and once here, they're easily spotted wherever you go. Iceland is also a hotspot for the dunlin, holding half or perhaps slightly more than half of Europe's dunlin population, or 280,000 pairs. In Icelandic, we call the dunlin lóu þræll. That means the slave of the golden plower. And it's probably because it kind of follows the golden plower around in the breeding areas. For the whimpearl, or spói, as we call it, we have 27% of the world population, or 250,000 breeding pairs. You may have noticed that we have a whimpearl in our logo. Iceland is also extremely important stopover for geese. They migrate between breeding grounds in Greenland and Canada and wintering grounds in Europe. But as you can see in this picture, waders often have a long bill, long legs, and a long neck that is very efficient for probing for food in mudflats, ponds, and earth. If asked what are my favorite species that migrate to Iceland each year, I would definitely choose the black-tailed godwit, a beautiful bird that has all the characteristics that are important for waders: long bill, long legs, and long neck. We call it jaðrakan. That's a very beautiful name in Icelandic as well. They are similar in size to the whimpearl. They visit Iceland to breed and start to appear here in the middle of April, and they live in the beginning of September to winter in Western Europe. The Icelandic black-tailed godwit can spend the winter as far south as Portugal, but mostly they winter in Ireland as well as in the UK. So they are a great example of a species that uses the East Atlantic Flyway migration route. They are exclusively a wetland bird and probe with a long bill on mudflats, marshes, and pond beds for worms. There are many challenges facing these birds, but what comes first to mind is the ongoing draining of wetlands in Iceland. Although waders have a stronghold in Iceland, many are declining worldwide. They rely on open vegetated habitat, but they also rely on water. And our wetlands have been drained extensively since the 1950s. Hence, restoring wetlands is a very important way to improve habitat for these birds. And we will also have to find ways to stop the drainage that's still going on. In the picture to the left, you can see a map of drained wetlands in the south of Iceland. It's just a small area, actually. Brown areas used to be wetlands, and the yellow lines are ditches. The ditch network is 34,000 kilometers in length, and around 70% of our wetlands are affected. And then the other picture to the right show you a wetland that we, fuglavernd, have been re-wetting since 1997, filling in the ditches with great success, creating better habitat for birds and other wildlife. So there are things that we can do to protect migratory birds in Iceland, and we will keep working hard on this challenge. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Hólmfríður, and we'll bring you back at the end for the Q&A session. That was fascinating, and some beautiful, beautiful photographs there of birds in Iceland. Now, flying down south, down our flyway, we're heading to Portugal and a particularly important site for migratory wetland birds, the Tagus Estuary. And here to tell us about it is Senior Flyway Programme Officer Ian Barber. Welcome, Ian.
Hi, Jamie. It's great to be here to talk about the Flyway.
Thank you. Can you introduce us to the Tagus Estuary? Where is it and what kind of site is it?
So yes, the Tagus River starts somewhere in sort of central Spain, and it moves southeast across the country and enters into Portugal, and then it joins it flows into the Atlantic Ocean near Lisbon, and that's where the estuary is, of course. And it's the largest estuary in Western Europe. So it covers about 45,000 hectares, which is, what's that, about 450 square kilometres. So it's a vast area. And it's made up of intertidal habitats such as salt marshes, creeks, mud flats with sort of surrounding agricultural fields. So it's much like the Wash area here in the UK, for those listeners who are familiar with the Wash. And consequently, like the Wash, it attracts huge numbers of waders and waterfowl and is one of the most important wetland sites in the whole of Europe.
Let's look at the types of birds that we might see there, or that might come there over winter. What sort of migratory birds are visiting the estuary?
Well, obviously during sort of spring and autumn, when the migration takes place, there are many species that stop over to forage and for food and to rest up. But there's a particularly colourful and stunning spectacle in the autumn when flamingos arrive.
Wow.
But it's the sheer number and volume and variety of water birds that make the Tagus special. So throughout the year, more than 300,000 water birds use the Tagus as a breeding or wintering site, and it's internationally important for about 11 bird species. They've recorded something like 36 different species of waders, so ones that the listeners will be familiar with, like dunlin and redshank and greenshank. Even the RSPB's logo, the avocet, occur there in large numbers, and curlew sandpiper. But it's particularly important for black-tailed codwits, with the site supporting an estimated 60,000 every year. And we just heard from Hólmfríður how important Iceland is for breeding black-tailed godwits. Well, the Tagus is equally important for black-tailed godwits on their migration. So, and black-tailed godwits, as we know, is an important species for the RSPB. We've been working to protect and increase the numbers breeding in the UK for many years now, particularly at some of our East Coast wetland sites, which is also forms part of the Flyway.
Why is Tagus Estuary so important for these birds on their migration journeys?
Well, the Tagus, as you can imagine, after having mentioned some of those figures to you, the Tagus is important. It's been designated as a special protection area under the EU Birds Directive, and it's also a wetland of international importance under the Ramsar Convention. So it's what's known as a Ramsar site. And consequently, it's a key site along the Flyway, which, as you know from the maps, it stretches from the north right the way down to South Africa in the south. And birds, when they're on their migratory journey, they fly for many, many hours, covering huge distances and often in challenging weather. And in order to survive these grueling conditions, they need to stop to rest and refuel. And the Tagus provides one of those sites where they can stop, rest, refuel, and head on their way, or even stay there if they're going to overwinter. And the Tagus, it's a bit like a motorway. It's service stations along the motorway when we go for a long car journey, if you like. And we know that it's important because we did a study a couple of years ago, and I'll mention this in a minute a bit in more detail. But we found that birds from over 30 countries around Europe and West Africa use the Tagus, as I say, on their migratory journey. And we even found birds from Canada actually turned up at the Tagus Estuary. So it's quite clear that the Tagus is really an important site, and it's an important site in that it connects sites along the Flyway. So as I say, they act like service stations on the motorway, and the Tagus is one of those really important sites.
Now, I know the Tagus has been under threat in recent years. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Well, sadly, for many years, the Portuguese government have been talking about the need for a new or an additional airport in Lisbon to cope with the increase in tourism. And in 2020, the government gave environmental clearance for the construction of a new airport at a site called Montijo, which is just adjacent to the Tagus estuary. And we believe, along with a lot of other organisations, that this will have a devastating impact on the birds that use the estuary, particularly from noise pollution and potential bird strikes of aircrafts. But unfortunately, the accompanying what's called environmental assessment that the Portuguese government put out didn't take into account the international importance of the site. It talked about the national importance, but it ignored that wider international importance for migratory birds. And they also proposed sort of untried and inadequate mitigation measures. And they also didn't really consider any other sites along around the estuary or in that area. So all in all, we thought it wasn't a good place to have an airport. And so we got together with other BirdLife partners, and it showed the strength of the BirdLife community. And we've been opposing this new airport for the last 4 years.
And this is one of the wonderful things about that, the BirdLife International Partnership, isn't it? That we can join together, especially when we've got an obvious link like that migratory, the flyway. So that's been our key role, hasn't it? Actually, kind of helping pull that together.
Indeed. So in Portugal, the BirdLife partner, which is called Speyer, they came together with other NGOs in Portugal, and they challenged this decision in the courts. And the BirdLife community, along with RSPB, we helped them along that journey. Initially, there was a petition that was raised, and over 40,000 signatures were people signed that petition. And several of the BirdLife partners, including the RSPB, produced videos for the Portuguese partner to be able to use in their publicity campaign. And the RSPB particularly have been raising awareness of the issue within our own publications, and some of the listeners may have read some of our magazines and blogs that we've put out about this. And we also assisted with negotiations or helping with the various conventions. I mentioned earlier the Ramsar Convention, and we've been liaising with these conventions to highlight the threats that are occurring there. But probably the most important thing that we did was we were asked to carry out a study of the Tagus estuary, and we pulled together a lot of data around satellite tracking data, around birds that have been ringed and then re-seen, so ring recoveries, if you like, for wading birds from a variety of sources, from universities and NGOs. And we put all that data together, and that was where we discovered that all these species from over 30 different countries use the Tagus. And they were actually using something like 350 of the most important sites across Europe. These birds are coming from and using the Tagus. So it's pretty clear that the Tagus is a really, really important hub for migratory birds. And we think we're starting to win the battle, because as a result of the report that we did, which was presented as part of the court case, the Portuguese government decided to establish an independent technical panel to look again at the proposal at Montijo, but also to look at other potential sites around in that area. And the independent panel has produced their report in, I think it was towards the end of February, beginning of March. And they clearly stated that the Montijo site is not suitable both on economic and environmental grounds. So they said, no, that's not a good place for it. And they did make other recommendations where it would be better place to have an airport. So we think we're winning the battle. There was a change of government, unfortunately, about a month or 6 weeks ago, and we're hoping that the new government will take heed of what their independent panel have said, and that they will look again at the airport and rule out Montijo as the place to put the airport and select a different site.
Thank you so much, Ian, and a really interesting update on that really important piece of work. Thank you, Ian, and we'll see Ian at the end for the Q&A session. Now, continuing our journey south, we're crossing the Sahara and visiting another hotspot for migratory birds, the savannas of northern Ghana in West Africa. This landscape is one of 5 areas, including the peatlands of southern Iceland, which we heard about earlier, along with the East Atlantic Flyway, where the RSPB is working with BirdLife partners and other organisations to restore habitats for migratory birds in a major new project supported by the Ecological Restoration Fund. In Ghana, it's all about restoring habitat between protected areas to particularly benefit small migratory birds like pied flycatcher, wood warbler, and yellow wagtail, amongst many others. And we've got a short video to show you about this work. So let's take a look.
There are oceans that disconnect us from other parts of the world. For you to travel to Europe, for instance, you need visa, you need to go through a certain process to be able to go. But these birds are able to connect our worlds. They don't need visa to fly from Europe to Africa, they just come. They know no boundaries. There are more than 100 bird species that visit us as migrants.
When you see these migrants come back, how do you feel? Is it exciting?
Yeah. Yes, it's quite exciting to have additional birds add up to what you already have. And you're also excited that at least they've been able to go to where they breed and then they are back to their fatherland. Let me say their fatherland, because they don't breed here, so they go to their motherland to breed and then they are back to their fatherland. Currently we are in the Mole National Park. The Mole National Park itself is an IBA, which is an important bird and biodiversity area. The area that connects Mole landscape to the Bui National Park is where we want to build this connectivity. Areas that are much degraded, we will restore them. Areas that are farmlands that we think we should be able to do something to better the environment, we will do that. So it's about restoring degraded areas and also building capacity of the locals to be able to understand the importance of this area to migratory birds and other animals. So that is basically what building these corridors mean to migratory land birds and also elephants and other wildlife.
It's really, really lovely to see. So where are we going next on our journey? Let's take a look. We're still in West Africa, and I think we're moving along slightly. So in another part of the flyway, we find a particularly important country for turtle doves, and as you can tell, we're big fans of them. They're a seriously threatened bird, and we're trying to do our best to help them here. We've got it on the front of our magazine. One of our best loved migratory species. So this particular spot we're going to visit now is Senegal. And to tell us about his work and Senegal and the amazing migrations of turtle doves, we have Chris Orsman. Hello, Chris. You just need to unmute there, Chris, and then I'm going to ask you to tell us a little bit about what you do with turtle doves and your work.
Hi, Jamie. How are you? All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Right. Could you tell me a little bit about your role and what your work is with turtle doves, and then perhaps a little bit about their migration for those who aren't as familiar with them?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I've been lucky enough to be working on turtle doves for almost 10 years now. And I was initially brought in to help the team investigate what the migration routes might be. So we obviously know quite a lot about what goes on in the UK. A lot has been done to investigate the threats that they face in the UK and on the breeding grounds, things like agricultural intensification, loss of habitat, and even disease. But whilst we have a vague idea of where they might be going in the winter, we don't know how they get there, what routes they take exactly, and where precisely they end up. And until we really know a bit more about what those potential threats that they face on those routes and destinations, we really can't build up a proper picture of where we should target our efforts to try and rescue them, if you like. So what we have done is we've put some satellite tags onto a handful of birds in the UK, and also some of our colleagues and partners in France and Spain have done similar work. And all together combined, we've found out what the migration routes are. And we found that they basically meet up with the birds in France and they travel through Spain and Portugal. and then on to Morocco. And then from there, they face possibly their largest challenge, which is to navigate over or around the Atlas Mountains and then across the arid zones of Western Sahara and Mauritania. And then eventually they hit the Senegal River, which is in the very far west of Africa. And that's the first sort of landfall that they get after that long journey, where there's plenty of water and hopefully plenty of food for them. So that's what we've learned so far.
And what interests you so much about these birds and their migration? What's drawn you to them?
Well, even before I started working specifically on turtle doves, I was lucky enough to do some work in West Africa, again on birds, but not specifically turtle doves. But I was really overwhelmed by the numbers of turtle doves that sort of congregate in the region. And knowing how poorly they were doing in the UK and elsewhere in Northwest Europe, I was really, really interested to know where it was, what routes they were taking and where they were ending up. But since we've started the work, I mean, some of the fascinating facts that have been thrown up, I mean, are just incredible. Like, it's not unusual for a bird to be able to travel about 1,000 kilometers in one night. They're nighttime migrants, as you might be aware. Lots of our migrant birds are. But 1,000 kilometers, I mean, that's pretty extraordinary. But as well as that, there are some individuals who've kind of flummoxed us. They've actually made stopovers in what appear to us to be completely vegetation-free arid zones within the Sahara, and yet they spend a couple of days there, and then a couple of days later they're on the move again. How they manage it, we just don't know. It's incredible, it really is.
The whole migration of birds just still blows my mind. Every time we do these sessions, there's some little nugget or fact, and I think, how does that even happen? Now, turtle doves are particularly famous for their purring call. Let's see if we can have a listen to the noise they make when they're here in the UK. That's truly lovely. Sound of summer, that is. And also, I think it's where they get their name. Is that right, Chris? Because the French for it is tourterelle. So it's the tur is of the turtle. It's more about not the pattern of the plumage, but more about that sound, isn't it?
It's more to do with that onomatopoeic sound, the purring, I think, of the calling males. It is the males that tend to do the purring. Yeah.
Lovely. Right, now let's go to Senegal. So can you give us a sense of the landscape where they're found in Senegal, and what's it like to visit there during your research trips?
Well, as I said, the birds make sort of landfall in Senegal along the Senegal River, and it's in October, which is roughly the time that they start arriving. It's quite green. It's quite humid. It's just coming out of the rainy season. But things change quite quickly. Things start to dry out whilst there's plenty of water along the river itself, but the food supply starts to diminish. And so the birds tend to move along the Senegal River eastwards and southwards, and then across and into Mali, and some of them even reaching as far east as the inland Niger Delta. But the landscape, it does get quite hot later in the year, and really quite dry and very challenging both for us and the birds. But they do manage to find refuges, like in the image we can see at the moment. This kind of acacia scrub, this thorny acacia scrub is just typical of the habitat that they're looking for to seek refuge during the day and for roosting at night time as well.
Why is it so important that we better understand turtle doves and their migrations, particularly around these kind of wintering habitats and things?
Yeah. Well, it's one of the things, one of the gaps in our knowledge was where they were ending up and what routes they were taking. So we really needed to find out a bit more about what was going on the ground. So, you know, visiting Senegal to some of these places where the birds were ending up, for example, was important to fill that gap in our knowledge. And whilst we haven't got any evidence that there are any major threats that might be limiting the population on the wintering grounds, we better understand the routes that they're taking, and combined with the information, the evidence that we have that they are facing problems on the breeding grounds, And now we've discovered that they are obviously passing through areas where there's quite a lot of hunting pressure. We can really target our efforts now on both the breeding ground issues and the issues on the migration route through those areas where there is hunting. So ruling out that the potential problems on the wintering grounds has helped us target our efforts to try and turn around the fortunes of the turtle dove.
Thank you, Chris. Sorry for interrupting you. There was a slight lag, but I was just going to say, you can see on your screen there. We were showing the routes that the turtle doves take, the ones that we know are sort of breeding here in the UK, down sort of the western side of Europe and Africa there. Thank you very much, Chris. And we're going to bring you back in for the Q&A at the end. And now for our final stop on this journey down the East Atlantic Flyway. Just before I say that, please do send your questions in. We've got a couple of questions already, but if you have a question about bird migration, particularly around the flyway, pop them into the Q&A and we'll endeavour to answer them at the end. So for our final stop on this journey down the East Atlantic Flyway, we've reached its southern tip now, and we've arrived in South Africa. And now, live from South Africa, is our next guest to tell us more about South Africa's role on the flyway and the work being done there to protect migratory birds. So welcome, Jess Wilmot from BirdLife South Africa. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Jamie. Thanks for having us. Best for last.
Absolutely. Everyone's been amazing. This has been absolutely fascinating. Now, you're the Flyway and Projects Manager at BirdLife South Africa. Can you tell us a bit about what that means and what kind of work do you do?
So as a BirdLife partner, we align our work to BirdLife International's Flyway program, which focuses, of course, on migratory species. And as we all know, unfortunately, migratory species are in decline. And we're realizing that it's futile to protect them in your site when they face several threats along their migratory pathway. So consequently, birds are actually forcing us to work with our national and international partners along these flyways. And South Africa is lucky enough to be situated in two: the East Atlantic Flyway on our west and the Eastern African Eurasian Flyway on our east. And we work with partners within these flyways to coordinate efforts to conserve these birds. Together with RSPB and working closely with Ian Barber, we try to coordinate our conservation efforts with 5 Southern African regional partners, as well as internationally within the East Atlantic Flyway. And we're actually busy updating our conservation strategy to ensure that it remains relevant to partners as well as species needs and priorities.
Do you have a favourite migratory species that visits South Africa?
I do, actually, and as you can see on the screen, it's the regal European roller, and it's actually consequently one of the species we're monitoring. It's just such a beautiful species. I love the way they roll during their territorial fights, and knowing that they travel close to 10,000 kilometers annually is just admirable.
They are stunning birds. South Africa is obviously at the far end of the flyway. So how does that affect the species that come to you?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and one we'll only really fully be able to answer with more research. However, what we do know is because it's at the end of the flyway, these birds are facing many threats, like climate change and the loss of suitable habitat and resources. The birds could actually be changing their migration pathway accordingly, and this could include short stopping, so they won't travel as far to South Africa. They'd rather stop at a suitable stopover site within their migration pathway, which makes sense. You know, why travel all the way when you find a site that has enough resources to support you? However, this has several knock-on effects, including increased competition for resources amongst migratory and resident species. So this just emphasizes really 2 concepts, the one being the importance of ensuring key stopover sites, making sure that they're in good condition. Like Ian was saying, the Tagus estuary, without protecting that, water birds might not actually have enough resources to travel all the way to South Africa. And then the second concept is establishing research projects that aim to understand these fluctuations in population trends.
Sounds like you've got a lot going on. Is there anything else you'd like to tell us about that BirdLife South Africa are doing?
Yeah, just, elaborating on the fantastic or very fascinating European roller project that we've got going. We established it in 2022 to monitor the population in South Africa when they come in November and they leave again in March. A lot of research is done at the breeding sites in Europe, but we actually have no idea about the resource use in South Africa or the threats they face along the way. They tagged a few birds in Europe, and they only reached Angola, Namibia, and Botswana, but none actually reached South Africa. So excitingly, we tagged 2 individuals. We'll have to tag 4 more. It's a very expensive exercise. But yeah, it's very fascinating to see where these birds are going. We have 2 individuals. They traveled along our east coast. One is currently in the Horn of Africa, and the other one is just aiming towards Pakistan, flying more than 2,500 kilometers in 2 days. So like Chris was saying, we need to understand where these species go, so that we know where to focus our conservation efforts. Yeah.
Exactly. Alan's just asked what that beautiful blue-green bow was, and that is the bird that Jess has just been talking about. That's the absolutely stunning European roller. I've been lucky enough to see one in the UK, and when the sunlight catches it, you know what I mean. It really is a very, very, very bright colour. Absolutely stunning bird.
Yeah.
And thank you so much, Jess. And we'll bring you back in at the end for the Q&A session, if that's okay. Absolutely fascinating. So we followed the flyway all the way from Iceland to South Africa. And we'll be hearing more about migration secrets in next week's webinar, same time next Tuesday. But now it's time for a weather forecast. Well, a bird migration forecast. So I'm going to welcome my colleague Luke Phillips, who has some news for us and more forecasting. Over to you, Luke.
Indeed. Yeah, thanks very much, Jamie. Oh, I'm not sure what slide that is, though. We might have to go on to the next. There we go. That's the right slide. So yeah, this is merely a moment for me to brag, actually, because we've been doing this weekly sort of bird migration forecast. Last week, I made quite an ambitious forecast in terms of what might actually likely turn up. And I said, I reckon a collared flycatcher is going to show up. And lo and behold, 2 turned up. Last week. So this particular bird was a picture that Toby Carter took at Spurn in East Yorkshire, and the other was in Fair Isle, which is a little island way up north off Shetland. And yeah, so that was particularly exciting. And that's just my little moment to brag there. But on to this week's forecast, though. And actually, it starts to get a little bit tricky beyond here, because most of our breeding species in the UK, by the time we're getting into sort of almost mid-May, most of them are back now. But there is a few birds that do turn up quite late. And we've already heard a little bit about turtle dove, and turtle dove's a bird that can turn up quite late. So maybe that's one to look out for in the next week as well. But spotted flycatcher is a particular one I wanted to spotlight this week. They typically come back in early to mid-May. Now, this is a bird that, if there's a few of you here who've been bird watching a long time, you might have noticed a bit of a decline with the spotted flycatcher. Certainly in my lifetime, which isn't all that long, but I've certainly noticed them sort of disappearing a little bit from Dorset, where I am. But they are still a bird that you still can see turning up at this time of year. Look out for their sort of darting flight out from trees. They fly out particularly fast. They've got very flicky, quite distinctive wings, and they grab insects and fly back into the trees. They love to nest in sort of ivy, and they've even been known to nest in people's porches and things like that as well. So a bird that you can find up and down the length of the country, so definitely one to watch out for this week. Next up is something quite different, but a bird that will definitely be showing up in the next week. This is a nightjar. So nightjars are birds of kind of open country. So whether that's heathland down on the south coast in Dorset, or on in Sussex, places like Minsmere have little patches of heathland where you find these. Or further north, I've been into Wales, even Yorkshire, even up in the edge of Scotland as well. They'll use things like young forest replantations or edges of moorland as well. So very much birds of open country. They turn up this time of year because their main diet is moths. So they kind of hang on a little bit later than some other birds to make sure that there's plenty of moths on the wing. But the best thing about nightjar, apart from its bonkers plumage, is the call. Which you're not going to play now. You'll have to go and listen to one yourself. But go out at dusk in likely habitat, and fingers crossed you'll get your first nightjar in the next week or two. On to the next species. One we've already seen, actually, which is highlighted in that fantastic little section on Iceland. Absolutely loved that. That was brilliant to hear about all those Icelandic breeding birds. But this time of year is a really good time for look out for waders in their breeding plumage. So many of them, they'll be looking really, really smart just before they head off on that final bit of migration up to Iceland and around into the Arctic Circle. And dunlin is a bird that you can, see at lots of wetlands at this time of year. During migration, strange things can happen. So if you're inland and you've got access to a little wetland or a reservoir or a lake, or even sometimes just a muddy patch in a field, waders can sometimes drop in and you can get a bit of a surprise. And dunlin is a bird that you might see. There's other birds to look out for this time of year, though, with waders. Look out for grey plover. They look exceptional this time of year. And even a few rarities start to turn up, and maybe Temming stints, one I'll name drop for the next week or so. But yeah, lots of waders on the move this time of year. On to the next species, please. Right, so this is one where I'm going to be a little bit more ambitious. And actually, I started thinking about what to talk about today a few days ago. And this one kind of, it's sort of trumped me. So this is the bee-eater. It's a bird that lots of you are probably familiar with, because there's been lots and lots of talk about bee-eaters in the last few years, because we've had them breeding at a few locations actually in Britain. And it's a bird that seems to be turning up a little bit more frequently. So this bird normally you'd see throughout Spain, south of France. If you've ever been on holiday there in the summer, the bee-eaters are kind of a constant presence overhead, obviously eating bees, but they also eat things like butterflies and dragonflies and other large flying insects as well. But yeah, by the time we get into mid-May, this is when we might start to see bee-eaters show up. And indeed, yesterday, one turned up at Portland Bill, which is about 20 miles or so from where I am right now. And I've also heard of 2 other flocks that showed up over the last couple of days as well. Now, the weather forecast for the next week or so looks like there's some warmer weather coming in from the south, which may well help bee-eaters. And so I would predict that we may well see some more bee-eaters showing up. And obviously, there's that huge question that everybody asks at this time of year: will they breed again this year? Well, we'll have to wait and see. So that's kind of it from me. And fingers crossed you see something good in the next week or two.
Thank you very much, Luke. Looking forward to an influx of bee-eaters. I'm going to bring everyone back in for the question and answers very shortly. Thank you to those of you who've sent in your questions so far. Some really fascinating ones. I'm just going to have a think about who can answer them. Well, basically, it's great. I've got a whole room full of experts here. This is very handy. So I'm going to start with one from Kate. Kate says, do any of the birds using the Atlantic Flyway disperse across the Sahel to East Africa? Now, can anyone answer that one? Do any of the birds that use the Atlantic Flyway disperse across the Sahel to East Africa? Or are we purely talking about West Africa?
Well, we spoke about this backstage ever so briefly, because we couldn't think of anything immediately obvious that does really do that. They mostly do tend to stick to that sort of western edge, but as with bird migration, anything can sort of happen from time to time. You do get some surprises show up. So undoubtedly, some birds do sort of wander off, but as a rule, probably not.
Probably not. Okay, thank you. Some turtle dove questions. So this is from Ian. How do the turtle doves move so far so quickly? Because we talked about the fact that they can move us. I forget what the number was, Chris. But overnight, was it like 1,000 kilometers or something huge like that?
Yeah, up to 1,000 kilometers in a night. Yeah.
Goodness. So Ian says, are they picking up high speed, high altitude winds, or are they just phenomenal flyers?
I'm afraid I couldn't tell you what sort of altitude they're flying at. The tagging hasn't actually told us that much. But they are superbly fast flyers. In fact, that might be one of the issues that they face, is because they're so fast that they make good sport. So that tends to make them a bit of a target for hunting. Obviously, that's when they're flying during the day. We're talking about flying at night. But that might be why they're able to cover such enormous distances, is their speed and the fact that they don't face so many hazards at night.
And I suppose when you think about the family of doves and pigeons, we have racing pigeons, we have pigeons used to deliver messages during wartime. They are that kind of family of birds is known for its speed. So that would make sense. And if you see one flying, they are quite adept at moving fast. That moves us seamlessly into what other threats do these birds face? what are the specific threats to turtle doves at the moment?
Well, as we were saying, a lot of work has been done to examine what's going on in the breeding grounds, and one particular problem, which people may be aware of, is sort of agricultural intensification, which has over the decades has led to a reduction in the availability of critical volume types and volumes of seed at important times of the year for them to have a successful breeding season, such as the types of seeds that they might need when they arrive to sort of recuperate from their long migration, but also obviously to rear enough chicks during the season. But also things like scrubby areas in corners of fields, where suitable nesting places and decent refuge as well during the day. Those kinds of features have been disappearing. But also, as we said, we're discovering that the hunting levels have been kind of unsustainable along the migration routes as well.
Yeah, quite a few issues there, but we're getting close to find out what they are. And as we were saying, your work in places like Senegal is revealing that other part of the picture, isn't it? It's showing us these are the areas that they need on that route. Question for Jess now. Actually, this is a suggestion for Jess from Ros. We have very helpful viewers today. Ros is interested in the tagging research and said, have you looked into sort of sponsorship of individual birds, a bit like the BTO have done over here with cuckoos, giving the birds names and following their progress online. It's an interesting one, isn't it?
It is, and Roz, thank you for that. It's a very good suggestion. We have actually named the birds because people do associate with birds or individuals that have names and love following the progress. So our birds' names are Royal Wazi, which is Shangaan, royal, obviously because of the color blue, and Wazi is actually Shangaan, which is one of our native African languages for blue. And the other one is Hera, goddess of the sky. And we are very active on our social media pages, promoting where they're going and asking for funding. And one of my aims is actually to request additional sponsorship for tags.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Ros, and thank you, Jess. Question about climate change now. It's something we need to be addressing in every single one of these sessions, I think. Richard says, how are increasing temperatures plus climate change, wetter winters, hotter summers, affecting bird volume? So there's kind of population levels and also migration patterns in the flyway over time. Anyone want to comment on the impacts of the climate crisis?
Well, I think we all know that the climate is changing, weather patterns are changing, and this has an impact right the way across sort of nature as a whole. So plants come into flower and to bloom different times now, which impacts on insect numbers at different times of the year. And so birds are trying to adjust to meet those different demands. So it's a problem because what is today is a good site for, and we talk about important bird and biodiversity areas, what's a good site today might not be so good in the future with the changing climate. So that makes it even more important that we protect as much of our land as possible, not just areas that have designations, but try and protect as much as possible, because those areas that are good now might not be so good further down the line.
Yeah, it's all about future proofing, isn't it? It's definitely going where a bird's going to need next. And also in a webinar we ran last year, we talked about wetland birds moving up from Europe and starting to breed more in the UK. And are we planning ahead for those sort of climate related movements up through an expanding and changing of ranges? So that's also quite important, particularly with wetland birds, I think. Veronica's got a good question. When did migration studies start? And has technology had a great impact on this? Well, Veronica, you're going to love next week's session because that's when we go into a lot more detail about tagging. I don't know when migration studies started. Does anyone know? How long have we been looking at this for?
Well, I mean, I guess we could refer back to, I can't remember the actual year of this, but there was one of the very first indications of migration was the famous white stork. Was it Germany, which returned back presumably from Africa with a spear that it had picked up, no doubt a long way from Germany, and brought it back. So that would have been the first sort of inkling of humans understanding that birds kind of migrate quite big distances. If anybody else can remember when that actually was, that may well be the start.
I think we might be going into that one a little bit in the next session. Actually, I think Guy Anderson will be talking a bit about the stork and the history. So Could be around that time. I mean, I remember I've got one of the one of the most famous natural history books, Natural History of Selborne by Gilbert White, and I know at the time he was writing this, however many years ago, he was talking about people talking about swallows, etc., nesting, spending the winter in the mud at the bottom of ponds. And obviously, I think he was in Victorian times. Anyone correct me if I'm wrong? I think he was a Victorian naturalist. So yeah, our knowledge, our understanding of this has moved leaps and bounds over the last 100 years or so. Deanne's got a good question. What is the easiest and best thing we can do living in the UK on our homes to support birds using the flyway? I've put up food and water and have Swift boxes up, but what else can I do? Well, there are some links in the chat about reporting things like tagged bird sightings to help us understand bird migration. But another thing you can do, of course, is to if you've got a garden or even a window box, you can be planting plants that help to attract insects and to feed insects, because a lot of these birds that are visiting us, and particularly those around our homes, are going to be insect eaters. Thank you very much to our colleague Nick, who's just reminded me that Natural History of Selborne was published in 1789. So since 1789, definitely our understanding, one would hope, has moved on quite a bit. John says, are swallows late in arriving this year? This is always a hard question. We normally have 12 to 15 pairs nesting, but I've only seen 2 so far in southwest England. I saw a couple at the weekend. I don't know if anyone got a view on whether swallows are late this year. Hard to tell, really, at this stage.
I would say they kind of are. They've not been in the abundance that you'd often expect at this time of year yet. So yeah, it's not too late, for things to kind of recover. But and every year kind of always a bit different, and they always feel late as well. I think you build up all that anticipation and you just can't wait for your first one. But
exactly.
But yeah, this last few days though, down here in Dorset, right on the south coast, there's been a real good stream of swallows coming in off the sea. I've been down to the coast the last few days, and they've been rushing through. So I reckon they're on their way.
Excellent. So look out for those coming, John. Hillary's got a question for you, Hólmfríður. This is an interesting one. I don't know if there is an easy answer. Do the volcanic eruptions in Iceland affect migrating birds?
Well, I don't think so, actually. Not this one.
Yeah.
But maybe earlier. Well, it's a very difficult question to answer. So we don't have any research that is kind of that comes to mind, at least. So
yeah, nothing we could think. I mean, I'm thinking that massive one that grounded all the planes in Europe. I mean, yeah. It's hard to measure, but an interesting point, Hillary. Thank you. Now let's just have a look through what else we've got here. There's been a lot of questions.
Sorry, if it's all right, I'll pick up on, because Doug's mentioned, he's just mentioned lesser whitethroat. And
yes.
I think I know why he's mentioned lesser whitethroat, because there's a question of birds that move across to East Africa, and that is a species that has it's a passerine, that one of the warblers that breeds in Britain, alongside lots of other ones like common whitethroat, but their migration route is completely different. They don't actually follow the Western Flyway. They head from Britain. They actually start heading southeast, and they end up going through Italy, and then they move down the eastern side of Africa. So they've got a completely different migration to a lot of the other warblers that we see in Britain. So yeah, good flag from Doug. Lesser whitethroat's quite an interesting one.
Thank you very much, Doug. Now we do have a few more. Let me just go back to where I was. Did the high temperatures experienced in Spain and Portugal have an effect on bird life and migration patterns, says Ralph? So anyone want to comment on high temperatures in Spain and Portugal?
Well, I guess it relates back to what we were talking earlier about climate change and how that is generally having an impact on birds. And I know in Doñana, which is a famous wetland in Spain, there's been a drought there for many years. And with the over abstraction of water to feed the local fruit industry, that's had a huge impact on the number of birds that are able to use that site. So yeah, I think generally, increasing temperatures and a change in something from the norm is not good.
Thanks, Ian. And yeah, if you, Ralph, if you look on our YouTube channel for the webinar that we did called Wetland Arrivals, we go into a little bit more detail on Doñana and talk about a lot of those wetland birds having to relocate, basically. Good one from Karen. How do birds know when to migrate? Anyone want to take that one?
They set an alarm.
I'm going to go with a length of daylight hours. But is it something around that?
Yeah, that's definitely a big part of it. Yeah, daylight hours definitely triggers migration. But as with these things, it's never quite as straightforward. I suspect there's lots of other kind of factors that can play a part as well. And sometimes, you know, we mentioned about weather and things like that, and actually that can sometimes urge migration to kind of, you know, give it a kick up the backside, and you need to kind of get off. Or sometimes if the weather's really nice, birds will stick around and make hay whilst the sun shines. So yeah, quite a lot of factors. And obviously, it's that drive to want to breed as well. Birds need to get back. That urge is particularly strong in the spring. So yeah, lots of reasons.
And availability of food as well. So if insects are moving as well, then birds will also move. There's a famous case of the red-footed falcon that goes from India to East Africa, and it crosses the Indian Ocean, and it's basically following the dragonflies that move across there as well. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you both. Question from Alan. This is for you, Jess. Are there BirdLife South Africa reserves with hides along the Berg River?
Oh, BirdLife South Africa isn't fortunate like the RSPB to own any reserves, but the Berg River is actually a Ramsar site, and my colleague Dr. Giselle Morrison has a project there restoring that very important site for waders. There is one hide, and we actually have put in a proposal to upgrade it because aviary tourism is slowly growing along the west coast, but it's not enough because it's very important for conservation, growing aviary tourism. So hopefully soon.
Fingers crossed. Right, one from Paul. I love this. People are going into real detail now, and it's great how fascinated everyone is with this. So Paul says, if a male blackbird migrates from Scandinavia to the UK for the winter, while here finds a resident female mate, would he stay here, becoming a resident, or will she become migratory and follow him back to Scandinavia? Then the following winter, would she migrate to the UK or to Iberia, where I believe female Scandinavian blackbirds tend to migrate to? Does that happen? Do we know of cases of that? That's a new one on me, but really interesting question. Paul, we might need to mull that one over. We're not sure, but that would be an interesting case. And my thinking, my kind of gut instinct is, are birds that are on, you know, visiting their wintering sites, as it were, are they actually in that kind of mode of like, I must find a mate, I must set up a territory, or does that not kick in until they reach their kind of breeding grounds? That's where I go with that one. But it might be that Paul knows something that we don't. So we'll come back to that one afterwards and have a bit of a ponder. What else do we have here? Oh, we're nearly at the end, sadly. I think we've got kind of time for one more quick one. Swifts. There was a swift one. So Paul, again on swifts. Latest information on swift populations. Do they experience similar threats in other parts of the world that they experience here? Now, I know a little bit about this because I was at the Swift webinar a couple of weeks ago. So this is a good one. Swifts, we know that swifts here do face problems because of this kind of lack of nesting sites, but we also know that there could be problems around the lack of insects. But I think from what people were saying in the first session is that in other parts of Europe, certainly, the nesting site problem isn't so huge as it is here, perhaps. Does anyone know any more about that? That Swift's problems in other parts of Europe?
Well, yeah, I mean, what you said there, Jamie, is right. That I think our swift population is in steeper decline in the UK when you compare it against other places in Europe. So that's definitely the case. And you know, obviously we know the biggest drivers of swift decline is obviously one of the issues is habitat, nesting availability, but also just the numbers of insects that they need to be able to feed and raise their young as well. And you know, I think if you go on to mainland Europe, the situation there is a bit different in terms, you know, I can't speak on specifics, but insect decline isn't as big an issue potentially over there. It's still an issue for sure, but maybe not as bad as here. So, but yeah, so our swifts definitely need more help for sure to do what you can.
Thanks, Luke. Robert says, in mid-August in Loanga NP in Zambia, common sandpiper appeared on each oxbow lagoon, and the next day, wood sandpiper. Where do they come from? And by which flyway route, please? Anyone?
They probably came from more from the eastern side of Europe, as opposed to Western Europe. As Luke sort of mentioned earlier, there aren't many birds that go from the east to the west, or west to east, if you like. So yeah, it might have come along the other migratory route from sort of Central Asia through Eastern Europe and down into Eastern Africa, possibly.
Thank you very much. Oh, that was fantastic. And we do have a few more questions that we will have a look at afterwards, and we'll do our best to answer them, particularly the puzzling one about the blackbirds and their migration and breeding habits. I'd like to thank all our wonderful guests today. Thank you so much for giving up your time to talk today and answer questions. Thank you all very much for watching, and also thank you to the events team who work incredibly hard behind the scenes to make sure that these sessions run smoothly. Now, we do have one last session in this series next week. Please do come and join us then on the fourth and final webinar. We'll be looking at some of the mysteries that have baffled scientists for decades and exploring how research is helping us to understand more about the journeys that birds take. There are lots of ways that you can help protect migratory birds along the flyway, and one way is to help us understand more about bird movements. So if you do spot a ringed bird, report it, and this helps us build up a picture of where birds are going and allows us to do more for conservation. And you can see in the chat, there's more details on how to report a ringed bird sighting. And that's it. That's it from us. Thank you so much, and hopefully see you next week. Goodbye.